I would like to welcome architect Rajshekharan Menon and both our speakers to this session. And I also welcome Rajshekharan Menon to kindly introduce the theme. It sounds a little odd when I say Rajshekharan Menon, so I'll keep it to Raj. To introduce the theme, the speakers, and also to moderate the session, which is titled Collaborations for a Resilient Future. Raj studied architecture at CEPT Ahmedabad. He's a founding partner of RGB Architecture Studio based out of Kochi, which has a body of work that is critical yet familiar, modern yet enduring, and specific yet rational. Currently, he also serves as academic chair at SEED, a young school of environmental design at Kochi, with a deep desire to evolve a pedagogy that responds to the design needs of the contemporary world. Over to you, Raj.
Thank you. Thank you, Somini. Thank you, Avani. Thank you, the entire team that has put this together. Thank you, Bijoy. It's a real privilege for me to be here, catching up with all of you, catching up with Sarosh and Jahnavi as well. So this is the fifth talk of this series called the final symposium of Avani, called Ecologies of Adaptation. It's a very appropriate discussion that has been happening since yesterday. And I would like to thank the Avani Academic Council for having put this together, Saumini in particular to have led this so well. So we have two very eminent panelists today. I'll just move on to introduce both of them. And before that, just a brief about what this session is attempting to do. It is called Collaborations for a Resilient Future. I'll just read out the brief for all of you. The unexpected occurrences and unscaled events continue to cause disruptions to ecosystems, bringing human systems to a grinding halt. These events are often unprecedented, while sometimes repeating in the living memory of the planet and its people. What does our future look like? If the pauses and challenges are here to stay, how do we reclaim, repossess, and readapt the envelopes of inhabitations? What does collaboration and reciprocity mean in an inequitable, at times socially, physically distanced world? In search of a holistic approach to envision a resilient future, what could be the emerging coherent models of collaborations? I think that's like the key word that we're looking at in this session, and cross-disciplinary approaches, which can prepare and equip the ecosystem to sustain and adapt to environmental pauses. How do we envision ecologies of adaptation for a resilient future? Is there a collaborative design discourse in collectively addressing the challenges of an impaired world? What is our reset time? So to discuss in detail about this, we have two fantastic people who are here, who are fundamentally very multidisciplinary in their approaches and in what they're doing, even in the way in which they have built their careers and the kind of domains they've been able to pass through to reach where they are right now. We have Dr. Jahnavi Phalkey, who is the founding director of the Science Gallery Bangalore, SGB. And we have Professor Sarosh Anklesaria, architect Sarosh Anklesaria, who's the T. David Fitzgibbon Professor of Architecture and track chair of the MArch program at the Carnegie Mellon University. A brief intro about Jahnavi. Dr. Jahnavi Phalkey was appointed founding director of Science Gallery Bengaluru in November 2018. Previously, Jahnavi had a tenured faculty position at King's College London. She started her academic career at the University of Heidelberg, following which she was based at Georgia Tech, Lorraine, France, and Imperial College London. Jahnavi was fellow at the Institute of Advanced Study Berlin. She was also external curator to the Science Museum London and has been a scholar in residence at the Deutsche Museum Munich. Jahnavi is the author of Atomic State Big Science in 20th Century India and has co-edited Science of Giants, China and India in the 20th Century. She is the producer-director of the documentary film Cyclotron. Jahnavi read Civics and Politics at the University of Bombay and the School of Oriental and African Studies, London. She holds a doctoral degree in History of Science and Technology from the Georgia Institute of Technology, Atlanta. Warm welcome to you, Dr. Jahnavi. I move forward to introducing good friend Professor Sarosh Anklesaria. Um, he is an architect, educator, and the T. David Fitzgibbon Professor of Architecture at Carnegie Mellon, where he is also the track chair of the MARC program. Previously, he has taught design studios at Pratt, Syracuse, Cornell, Taliesin, and Yale School of Architecture. Anklesaria is interested in an expansive notion of architectural agency that synthesizes questions of socio-ecological pertinence. His work has been supported by the Richard Rogers Fellowship from the Harvard Graduate School of Design, the Taliesin Fellowship, and the Art OMI Residency. Recently, the Urban Symbiome, a design research project on the homologies between architecture, world making, and food systems, was published by Strelka magazine and featured in Expansions, a publication for the Venice Biennale. How Will We Live Together 2021. Anklesaria is working on a book that will offer critical appraisals of Le Corbusier's City Museum in Ahmedabad, as well as a speculative design project that connects the three built museums of Corbusier through an itinerant pavilion. The projects situate architectural agency with questions of ecology, temporality, and care. Sarosh holds a diploma in architecture from CEPT University Ahmedabad and a post-professional Master of Architecture from Cornell University. I think we can move on to the presentations. Very, very warm welcome to both of you and look forward to an engaging session, a very meaningful, riveting session. I'd like to call upon Dr. Jahnavi to go first. Jahnavi.
Thank you. Thank you, Raj, for the warm welcome. Thanks especially to Bijoy, Soumini, and yourself for having me here. Bijoy has a history of drawing me into conversations that I have absolutely, how should I put it? That I come in from sort of left of field, and they lead to sometimes interesting outcomes. But let's see what happens this time, because I see that I'm surrounded by students of architecture, practicing architects. I am more at the user end, trying to create something. So let's see how this conversation goes. Allow me to present to you what it is that I do and why I bring my pleas and laments to you in this conversation. So is my screen visible to you, and is everything okay? If someone could just, because I can't see you.
Yes.
Excellent. Fabulous. Let's start. So what I'll do is I'll briefly run through what it is that I do at Science Gallery Bengaluru, because that's essential for me to be able to speak to you today about futures, about resilient futures, and what space means for us as an essentially collaborative institution. The thinking on this for me has become all the more pertinent because, as you're all aware, the pandemic brought to a halt many a construction project, but it also rendered many a space unusable or inaccessible. And therefore, for us, which is a museum-like space, we did not have, not that our building is ready yet, but even so, we no longer had access to public space and had to move online like most of our colleagues. This meeting itself is being held online. And so what does that mean to then think about going back to a space, a physical space, right? So the relevance of a public space as we thought about it before, what we wanted to deliver, what we think about it now, and what we hopefully might actually expect from it going forward. So quickly, Science Gallery Bengaluru is a part of an international network of galleries. We have 5 in Europe, 2 in the United States, 1 in Australia. All of our galleries are based on university campuses. So the idea behind the gallery concept, so to speak, is to have collaboration across practitioners and scholars from various disciplines, including art and engineering, and of course, architecture, for all of us to come together in order to rethink or reimagine our relationship to knowledge and knowledge making. Bangalore is an outlier in that we couldn't place the gallery on a university campus. And this is relevant. This is relevant to think about physical space, but also institutional structures, because structures are enabled by space, but also structures disable spaces. So we are an autonomous institution because in Indian universities or Indian higher education is conducted in silos, as all of you are aware. You are either trained in or are training in a campus that is primarily about architecture or sometimes design. So you can go to a National Center for Biological Sciences, a CEPT or a SPA, or a TIFR, a Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, or a Tata Institute of Social Sciences. You seldom find, or there are very, very, very few universities in India where you can study everything from cinematography to physics to law and medicine on a single campus. Therefore, the chance for a young person to have dinner or be housed in a dormitory with someone who is not studying or is engaged in knowledge making or knowledge absorption or knowledge or contributing to research in a field other than your own is very, very small. And so therefore, placing a gallery of this kind, which was essentially about collaboration across disciplines, across practices, would be a difficult thing to accomplish. The second thing is public engagement budgets. The purpose of a gallery which is a museum-like institution, but it's not a museum, and I can answer that question in the discussion, so our universities don't have an understanding of or budgets high enough to invest in public engagement. Their primary task is seen as that of knowledge impartment, knowledge creation, knowledge dissemination, but not in any way public engagement. So the budgets for our universities for public engagement, if at all present, are so negligible that to try to establish a public engagement space again became difficult. As a result of which, the government of Karnataka stepped in, and we are therefore an autonomous institution established by the government of Karnataka, working very closely with not one, but 3 academic institutions that are named here. What is it that Science Gallery Bengaluru does? Now, as I indicated, we are an autonomous institution functioning slightly different from the rest of the network. The rest of the network functions with the idea that this is a place where art and science collide, which was a difficult idea for someone like me who's trained in history of science to begin with, to consider, historically, to consider that art and science were so separate from each other that they need to actually come together in collision of any kind is difficult to sustain, because the divisions between the two are barely 120, 130 years old. And so I decided to work to in a way expand the idea of art to a more broader idea of culture, to allow for all kinds of artistic or creative expressions to find place in the work that the gallery does. And also, given my own training, but also a historical understanding of what science has been, or therefore knowledge has, processes of knowledge making have been, to look at science as inclusive of both the human and the natural sciences. And so once we kind of, look at science as both the human and natural sciences, culture as encompassing all forms of creative expression, then what is it that we want to do at the gallery? So experiment became an operational word both for the experiment that this institution itself is becoming, because there isn't anything like this in India at the moment, but also as simply experiment in terms of what it means. That's our method. We encourage experiment, and not metaphorically, not analogically, but genuinely lab experiments. So this is what our way of doing work is. What is important here to note, because we are discussing collaborations, is that public engagement, or the pink part of this chart here, is what is more or less common to all of us 9 galleries across the world. The public lab complex, which operationalizes our word experiment, is unique to us. So that's where in Bangalore, we are taking the existing gallery model in order to think about the next 10 to 15 years, as opposed to what has worked in the last 10 years for that idea. So we have a natural sciences lab, a materials lab, a new media lab, food lab, black box theater, theory lab, and a dark room. Again, happy to take questions on that. Why these clusters? These clusters in order to come together to reimagine our relationship with nature, because that's what is required. Raj mentioned ecological crisis. We are aware of climate change. The pandemic has brought home the message of the discordant ways in which the animal world and the human world are nestling or not nestling against each other. So instead of asking detailed and siloed questions in biology or bioengineering, can we go back to the realm of natural philosophy and ask bigger questions that are more relevant today, which can then, of course, find their way in more detailed work in the laboratory, where a historian and a social scientist can work alongside a natural scientist. And similarly, you can interpret the other laboratory spaces. Also happy to come back to that, but that's what we mean by experiment, and that's what we mean by collaboration. And that's also what makes us to some extent unique within the network. But also when we think of what public spaces for science or for knowledge or spaces that bridge the distance between research and the public look like today, many spaces allow for the laboratory to come to the public. Seldom do they allow the public to enter the laboratory, and that's what we wish to accomplish with this space. To quickly sort of say a few things about what we've been doing so far, it's the public engagement work that has begun. The public lab complex is under construction, and I will speak to that towards the end of this presentation. We have started with public engagement work. So far, we've held 4 exhibitions. The first 2, Elements and Submerge, were physical. The next, Phytopia and Contagion, were online. Contagion is still ongoing. It ends only in December. We had its first phase until June, and we are in the second phase right now. This is what we do. I mean, these names are not to kind of indicate the eminence of those institutions, but to simply say that we work in deep collaboration, not only with cultural spaces, but also with research laboratories, because the goal is to bridge the distance between people and research. So what at the gallery is our expectation from architecture? I'll go to some detail and try to show you what our exhibitions look like. But before I do that, let me talk to you about the nature of our public space. It is in the first instance, we are a public institution. It is open for all. And therefore, the building needs to give a sense of openness, right? Now, that openness is something we expected the building to have before, but also especially after the pandemic situation is gone. We want the built structure also to take away, to the largest extent possible, the inhibitions around research establishments. Research establishments in India are seen as spaces that are closed to the public, and spaces which deal with knowledge in manners such that people don't feel like they have a stake there. People don't feel they have any say in it. I think fundamentally one could make the argument that in Indian society and polity, we are comfortable with the idea through millennia that knowledge is not a public good. And our built structure to some extent should overcome that comfort, that position of comfort we occupy, where knowledge, it's fine that knowledge is not a public good. Delivering collaboration. We want this building to enable collaboration, not only showcase it. And what does that collaboration mean? I think I'll be able to show it to you when I just give you a glimpse of what our exhibition do. Openness and room for serendipity, not only literally, right? Because when we say built space should be open, it's not about just simply putting glass or having lots of open spaces, but it's about how do you create habits of openness and conversation, and therefore what kind of space, or what kind of space, of course, and what kind of structures do you need to put around it within the 4 walls, but also, and then the responsibility on us in terms of programming, of course, is to how to think about that openness and serendipity beyond the built space. This institution proposes an imagined future for learning, especially self-driven learning, but it's also a space where people come and participate in, for example, our fellowship program, our public engagement program, and there are various aspects to it, which allows for a collective learning, which includes not only various disciplines, that I mentioned, like the natural sciences and the human sciences, which also includes engineering and architecture. So how does this get expressed? So these are the kinds of things I throw at people who work with me, right? In order to help understand how is this built space going to realize this imagined future where intergenerational conversation around knowledge making, intergeneration exchange around practices that have been learned through experience can be shared and built upon further. In short, I think in many ways, what we are asking for is the creation of a context, a physical context for science, culture, in its experimental form or in experiment literally come together. So space for us, and I mean, it's not just for us, but as you will know from your own professional experience, is context. And that's what we are asking to be built. The one thing that I want to kind of, throw out, and I'm hoping that this will be taken up in the discussion, especially because we have many eminent practitioners, but we also have learners in this room. And this is something that over the last 3.5 years, I have grown increasingly uncomfortable with. I am a historian of science by training. My training is largely in the humanities. I did civics and politics before that, from which I'm guessing I draw some of my sense of, civic science, civic responsibility, democracy, knowledge as a public good, all of these ideas, right? What I see happening around me, both in the space for art as well as architecture, is that words have become the primary tool for the artist and for the architect to communicate their message. I'm not saying words belong only to, literature, or, or words are the primary tool only for literature or only for the human sciences. Or this is not a call for exclusion. This is not a call for propriety. This is not polemical. This is an expression of a serious struggle that people like myself have, because we think in words. I realized that with its gravity in a most serious manner when I made a film, because I went and I came back with lots of words. I came back with talking heads. I did not come back with sufficient B-roll, as filmmakers call it, for a visual realization of that idea that I wanted to make a film about, that I wanted the film to settle around, and that I wanted the film to communicate. And that is the moment I realized that, words are also not necessarily, words are definitely not a filmmaker's primary tool. And that's what I see is happening with a lot of architects, with a lot of architectural discourse, with much of the discourse around built space and learning, is that words are becoming the architect's primary tool, which I think is limiting, which I think is problematic. And I'm happy to, be proven, I'm happy to discuss this actually, because I'm fairly confident in my observation that this is what's happening in both the art world and in architecture. So this is what we, science, culture, and experiment, as expressed through the periodic table. This is the context in which we want to, ground our institution. This is what more or less, the building that is currently under construction will look like. There are some alterations to this, especially for color, but more or less, this is what our building is going to look like. I could actually stop here and not say more about our exhibitions, and I'm happy to bring that up, in our discussion as we move ahead, because the more detailed presentation about our exhibitions is really to showcase the kinds of collaborations we do. But I think the detail of the collaboration doesn't really matter, because it's basically a coming together of ideas, of people, of practices that nestle or juxtapose, sometimes struggle against each other. With the idea is that it's the coming together of people across these across spaces, across ideas, across learning, that does lead to newer ideas, a reimagination of future, future learning, but also reimagination of better futures, etc. So those are the ideas that inform the collaborations we do, and that is the context that we, wish to see realized in built space. And the wall or the struggle arises when it's words against words as opposed to words against space, right? And which is the expectation someone like me would have from an architect. So I'll stop there. Is that okay, Samini, to sort of keep the detail for the discussion, because then I can pick up specific examples. So yeah, thank you very much again.
Thank you, Jahnavi. Sarosh.
So thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Raj. Thank you, Somini. Thank you, Bijoy. And thank you, everyone at Avani, for putting together such a fantastic series of talks. I'm really honored. I'm excited to be presenting after Jahnavi. And Jahnavi, thank you for such an illuminating presentation. So today, my talk is going to be divided into three broad parts. It will, as Jahnavi has predicted, be perhaps a bit more visual. And I'm going to run through the first part, which will be about my background, essentially, and some kind of design experiments that I have been up to design, also just conventional, relatively more conventional design projects, but very much built architecture, because we are in a school of architecture. The second part of the presentation is going to be sort of pivoting around questions of transition design, which I want to talk about today, and world making. So what are the constitutive elements of an open, plural way of world making? And then the third part will be about the urban symbiome, which is the place where these things combine in terms of a speculative project. So I'm going to go through this very, very quickly. Just some buildings that I have worked on. Sort of a lot of these projects have been inspired by architecture that is very much in and of our place, the idea of carving, the idea of situating and nesting the building into the ground. And what stays with me somehow is the question of agency and labor. The fact that these are very common sites on construction when you do construction in India, but the kind of proximity of labor that one encounters everywhere one works. Again, sort of carving the building into the ground, and also this kind of schism, this tension between the labor, not just as people, of course it is very much as people, but also the scaffold, the marks of labor that remain and many times don't remain in the final building. So here again, compared to that, one sees the process that goes into both the drawing, but also the actual scaffold, the social and infrastructural scaffold that puts buildings together. And I have to say that I do all of this work with my collaborator and partner for many years, Riaz Tayyabji, with whom we run a firm called Anthill Design. And now I come to the second part of my talk, which is related to the first, because it thinks about what are the kind of designs for the future, since your prompt is very much about asking what are the kind of, what is the form of design thinking? What are the kind of intellectual scaffolds necessary for the future? And so here, I work with transition discourses, which take as their point of departure the notion that the contemporary ecological and social crises are inseparable from the model of social life that has been dominant over the past few years, whether categorized as industrialism, capitalism, modernity, neoliberalism, anthropocentrism, rationalism, patriarchy, secularism, or the Judeo-Christian civilization. So over the past 25 years, transition design has emerged as a multidisciplinary term across the humanities to advocate for epochal transformations rooted in the interconnectedness of social justice and ecological systems, calling for a new civilizational model beyond neoliberal global capitalism. And this builds on the work of many scholars across various disciplines, but in particular, I'd like to mention Terry Irvine, Gideon Kossoff, Cameron Tompkin-Wise, Ezio Manzini, who coined the term cosmological localism, and Arturo Escobar, who works with the notion of the pluriverse. So here, the pluriverse I find of particular interest because it is a theoretical construct for a world where many worlds fit. And I like this idea very much as a design prompt for architecture and the built environment. It entails the deconstruction of the global developmentalist model of late capitalism in the favor of hyper-local, autonomous, and inclusive models of world making that promote planetary solidarity across cultures. So it is both a local in its kind of thinking, but it also sort of is global in its kind of connectivities. And it is acknowledging the view that we are entering a planetary phase of civilization as a result of the accelerating expansion of the modern era, and that a global system is taking shape with fundamental differences from the previous time. But at the same time, I think it's important to acknowledge also that that there were systems in the past that, at least in terms of their worldviews, acknowledged a world where many worlds fit. So I'm contrasting, for example, the Da Vinci Man, which is very much male, which is very much drawn in abstraction, drawn with kind of these pure geometries, with the Andean goddess Pachamama. And Pachamama is drawn without geometry, without this kind of abstract Euclidean geometry. And she's drawn with all of the kind of life forms inside her and around her. And I will come to this in a minute. I think that these two kind of worldviews have to be acknowledged as different. And then I also want to talk about this painting, 16th century manuscript of a Persian Ramayana owned by Hamida Banu Begum. So this is a Persian Ramayana owned by the mother of the Mughal Emperor Akbar. And I'm fascinated by the multiplicity of life, the synanthropism between reptiles, mammals, birds, fish, other critters, and humans, with a bit of architecture in the background. And the ontological flatness of the painting privileges multiple subjects. By that I mean the fact that it is both conceived of and drawn as a miniature, as a kind of flatness without the perspective. It allows for a kind of blurring between what is foreground, background, detail, and overall. And I want to introduce so one important sort of aspect of the talk is going to be the fact that we need a new vocabulary for a new world. We cannot build the new world on the using the same vocabulary that we used to build the kind of modernist and postmodernist worlds. And so world making is one such term. I borrow it from Nelson Goodman. And I want to contrast that with worlding, which is a term from new materialism, in particular Donna Haraway, and world building, which is entirely different, which talks about Lord of the Rings kind of, it's essentially completely fictitious, but world making in and of itself is acknowledging that a building, more than other works of art, alter our environments physically, but more so through various avenues of meaning, and they inform and reorganize our entire kind of world experiences. And so here I divide the notion of world making into two broad ideas, or essentially into two parts. One is frameworks, and frameworks are, again, intellectual frameworks through which one can produce another world. Designs for transitions I just spoke about, pluriverse thinking I spoke about, and these I will talk about very shortly, especially temporality, maintenance, and commoning. And then how do we do that is essentially what the tools are for. They are the methods, the frameworks, the tactics, the tools, the strategies through which this is enabled. So the first part of it is going to be about care and repair. You might have been aware of this. The dormitories of this building in Ahmedabad by Louis Kahn were slated for demolition, and we tried to sort of help the voices against it by generating a campaign that looked at building not in a kind of hagiographic way. So we are not necessarily coming at this from the fact that Louis Kahn was a great architect and so his buildings must be saved, but more the idea that care and repair have to be part of an ethic of world building. And care and repair are essential in understanding, again, a pluriverse, not one person. So not Louis Kahn alone, but essentially the entire ecology of people, histories that have made this institute possible. And then I have to say that I was very helpful. I was very much, this was a joint collaboration with Shubhra Raje, who also presented at Avani, and Riaz Tayyabji. And then simultaneously, I've been interested in Sanskar Kendra, another relic of the modern time. And here, these are drawings from a studio we recently did, where we said, what if we, again, didn't view Sanskar Kendra as this heritage monument that has to be protected, but what if we blurred the boundaries between the city and the building, because that has been something that the building sort of suffers from. It does not have a way of for people to engage with it directly, and it somehow remains outside of the imagination of the city. And so these drawings came out of that studio, and again, they use ways in which one begins to blur boundaries, but also engage with ecological paradigms that are somehow, one might argue, missing in that kind of worldview. So rainwater harvesting, thinking about circularity of energies, and so on. And then again, this kind of flat drawing, which privileges a multiplicity, a plurality of different things existing in it. The second aspect of world making is temporalities, care and repair being the first. This is a photo that I actually stitched together, which is in fact two photographs from a trip to Lima. One of buildings done, Previ, which is a very, very famous housing project done by some of the most famous architects from the 60s. And then Villa El Salvador, which comes about, which is just essentially a bottom-up urbanism. And if both things were designed by architects, this is of course incremental, so this was designed in the 60s, this happened relatively quickly. The question is, how can we learn from the systems? How do we as architects, how does the formal kind of way in which we build learn from this mode? What happens if you mixed Villa El Salvador with something like the Farnsworth House, just intellectually as a question? And so this is a project we did where the client came to us saying, this was their house. They wanted a little office in the back, and we said, but they were sure that the building would grow over time. So we made the building as an exoskeleton. We were able to get away with a lot of glass because of the kind of veritable forest around the building. But the thing that kind of occurred to us was, can we create an open-ended system where the building can essentially grow over time? That was very, very important for us. So although this looks complete, we kind of decided that it had to be built. So the foundations, for example, are designed for a kind of incremental approach. And we tried to work with a structural engineer to create certain combinations that of incremental growth that would be possible. And so this is, again, thinking about the building not as a single object in time, but as a temporality, as something that would that can change over time, and various parts of the building can be removed and retrofitted over time. If I was to do this project again, I would not build it out of welding. I would build it out of bolting and essentially design it for disassembly, design it so that it can completely dissipate into the future, into its assembled parts again. So it can return back to the material ecologies it came from. Of course, the idea of temporality exists very much also in the past. In, for example, the work of Archigram, the plug-in city is one such example. And so here we have the completed building and possibilities by which it can grow and change. The third part of this is, I think this is already embedded in what I was saying, but the idea of circular thinking, that we do not design for a cradle-to-grave economy, but we design for a cradle-to-cradle economy. And so this is in Oroville, a project done by my students at Yale. And here we said, okay, what happens if we look at commodified housing, which actually relies on an individual ownership model with fixed spatial and material boundaries? And instead of that, what if we said that the materials should be things that are common, and the spaces should be things that are common. So what if we really took the idea of commoning and sort of married it with the idea of circular economy? So you don't think of materials as only things that exist in one place and time, but as things that are ecologies that move across space and time. And so we have a building here which is essentially a project of commoning. It has relatively conventional cores, but that's about it. Once the cores are put into place, everything else is a material bank. And so an on-site material bank and workshop facilitate a community of craftsmen, that men and women, that experiment with flexible construction methods using continuously recycled material thinking, primarily in wood, but also in other materials like fly ash and so on. And so you get this kind of core which can sort of be added onto, and you get this kind of, again, a layered ecology of materials through which the building can be built. And what I like about this is that there is also the agency of those building it very much involved in the process of putting together a commoning project like this. So while the entire community shares the material bank and resources, clusters of neighbors share cooking and bathing spaces. So it's not only materials that are shared, but also programs that are shared: cooking, bathing, kitchens. The community is organized around a central public atrium. And this is also, I have to say that this was a project where I was co-teaching with Anupama Kundu, but the ideas that are present in this are good for Oroville, but they're also good for other communities. They essentially posit a new way of thinking about materials and a new way of thinking about also programs. Again, I keep coming back to projects in history because I think that the pluriverse is built also on, it is not tabula rasa, right? So it acknowledges the histories, the knowledge frameworks that existed in the past. So this is the Fun Palace by Cedric Price, also a project from the 60s, which has this idea of mobility and constant reconfigurability already built into the project. And here I come to the last part of the presentation, which is around designing for biodiversity. And I want to start by acknowledging the work of Lynn Margulis, who was a scientist who did not gain a lot of attention when she was alive. But essentially, she said that it is not survival of the fittest, not Darwinianism, but it is synanthropism, symbiogenesis, making with, that essentially make who we are. So the human body, for example, is 150 times not human DNA, right? So the genes in your microbiome, for example, outnumber the genes in our genome by 150 to 1. So if it wasn't for other viruses, other bacterium, we wouldn't be alive, because we need those bacterium to manage so many processes in our bodies. And so in that sense, COVID and the virus itself is an outlier. Nature is much more about symbiosis than it is about survival of the fittest. Again, a pluriverse and not a monoverse. And so instead of the Da Vinci Man, we have really essentially a pluriverse, which is what we are. We ourselves, in and of ourselves as entities, we are constructed of a pluriverse. And also the view of nature itself. I mean, all of these first three views is essentially how modernism thought of the world, right? So you either view nature from a frame, or it is an intruder, or you sort of capture nature and put her in a cage. But what if we developed a symbiogenetic concept of working with nature? What would that world look like? And it is really essential that we start thinking like this, because we are in the middle of the sixth greatest extinction. So far, we have seen 5 extinctions, the last of which wiped out the dinosaurs. And we are, for the first time, due to climate change, this is the first extinction that is essentially caused by human actions. And so this is a site in Phoenix by one of my students who worked on this project at Taliesin. And Phoenix is, again, a place starved of water, and there are tons of golf courses everywhere. And the new millennials are not golfing so much. And so we said, what if we took over the golf course and we converted it using building waste? Because there is so much building waste that actually is present all over Phoenix, because Phoenix is booming and there's a lot of construction. And again, we have this cradle to grave economy. All this construction material goes into the landfill when new construction happens. And so what if we took this construction material and we created a project that was over, say, more than 100 years? And this project was essentially created in the layered fashion, where over time we would create not a landfill, but essentially another kind of ecology where different sorts of animals could thrive. So what the student did was she looked very closely at the ecologies of various kinds of threatened species from the area, and thought about what are the kind of environments they need to survive, and how can we sort of over time use building waste to create a kind of layered ecology. And the very last project, and after that I will stop, I apologize for going over, is a research project that I'm doing currently. I've been working on for a while. It is not really a design, it is more of a provocation, but it looks at the question, it uses food as a trigger, not as the kind of final product, but as a trigger for a kind of pluriverse thinking. So in London, food comes from all over the world. This is increasingly true even in countries like India, where we are getting food imported from halfway across the world. And there is no corner of the planet left anymore where we are not fishing, for example. So this is how fishing fleets are just between Indonesia and Sri Lanka, the kind of density of fishing. This can be seen on a website in real time, Global Fishing Watch. And we created this kind of drawing to understand just the scale of big ag in the United States. So this is these are these kind of large farms that hold cattle, and one can see this at the same scale, the Empire State Building or the fishing nets but that giant trawlers have, right? And you can see the blue whale here in that tiny little circle. That is the scale of these operations. They are planetary, they are massive, they are gargantuan, and they are completely and totally, they have completely and totally essentially created a monoverse, right? And soon we are going to have more, we probably already have more plastic in the ocean than we have fish. And when the pandemic hits, one sees that these highly efficient systems are also very fragile. They break down very quickly because there are only 6 massive meat packing plants in the country, 6 or thereabouts, and in the United States. And so when the pandemic occurs, workers cannot go to these meat processing facilities, and so we have to undergo these mass slaughters. Or, for example, with chicken, we grow so much chicken now that the total mass of farmed chicken exceeds the combined biomass of all birds on the planet. This is how much chicken we produce. And also, we have completely changed the animal itself from what it was in the 50s. There's a lot here that I won't go into, but I will sort of go back to the idea of cosmolocalism. What happens when we try to bring places of production very close to places of consumption? So as a provocation, the urban symbiome emerges from the detritus and the remains of the old economy and tries to produce new alliances. It is a proposed vision for a future based on an ethic of kinship, degrowth, and circular thinking. Located in the urban and peri-urban context of London, it can serve as a template for cooking new worlds across various geographies. It is located in London, but of course, this kind of thinking can exist anywhere. It is the ideas behind it that I am more interested in, and hence I do not think of it as a project. I think of it really as a provocation. The urban symbiome connects places of growing, preparation, and selling of food through a novel alliance of citizen farmers, builders, scientists, ecologists, consumers, immigrants, bees, birds, bats, butterflies, fish, bacteria, viruses, and plants. It is at once a hybrid building and a network landscape, a synthetic construct of the human and the natural world, unused and volunteered parcels of land, urban, peri-urban, and suburban building terraces and facades, defunct parking lots, lawns, golf courses, sites of the old industrial age are fused, depaved, and activated across territories through myriad acts of commoning, holding land together, not against this idea of the private ownership of land. The urban symbiome is a market. It includes the quotidian places of the city, its covered streets, temporary and pop-up markets, food kiosks, community kitchens, cooperative farms, places of nightlife and leisure. And these are spaces of empowerment. Markets are very much spaces of empowerment, quintessential institutions of public space, and the original incubators of small businesses. Also the place in London very much where migrants come together. And so far from a nostalgia for nature, the urban symbiome is tactical in its appropriation of the city. Decommissioned tunnels and air raid bunkers from the Second World War perpetuate a landscape of vertical farms using aqua, aero, and hydroponics, where food is grown in the surreal pink LED light. Some of this already happens in London. And then the urban symbiome is an archetypal antidote to 20th century networks of planetary agriculture. It is an antithesis to sanitized tabula rasa modernism and its machinic efficiencies. It remains dirty, it remains inefficient, it is partly feral and off the ground. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Fantastic, Sarosh. Thank you so much for that. And okay, just quickly getting on to the discussion part of it. I think broadly, there are two essential points that I would want to vex this. I would want to start the discussion from one, of course, is a reflection on architecture from the outside, and the other is a reflection on architecture from the inside. So, a non-architect and an architect being present on the same panel sort of facilitates that kind of a discussion, I believe. So there is this entire thing of the Science Gallery Bengaluru that Jahnavi has been working with, and I believe she has been working very closely with the architects, and so working close with the narratives of architecture, narratives of what she's been trying to establish. What is most interesting about this, and would be the case in a lot of the futures that we are going to talk about, are these hybrid kind of typologies which are going to come up. So I think, like a couple of days back, we met up, and something that Sarosh said was very, very interesting, that architecture is usually very slow because it is heavy and it requires time. It takes away a lot of energy. It just sits there, it's like a tortoise. It takes a while to sort of wake up to things which are happening around it. It's not as agile by nature. So it becomes all the more pertinent to understand how is it that the discipline, if at all it can be called that, can wake up to the idea of really hybrid kind of types that are going to evolve and emerge in the futures that we really want to be resilient, or we are hoping to be resilient. So I'd like to start from Jahnavi. I think she kept it really, really open for a huge discussion to follow suit. I would want to look at the whole idea of space. She mentioned about space as a collaborative institution primarily, and how architects, according to her, seems to be talking a lot about, architects and artists seem to be talking about describing space in as text, in words. I'd like to ask her what she really meant by this. Is that a problem with visualization and communication that she felt about this? How otherwise would you have wanted that exchange of idea to happen? Probably from then on, Sarosh can take on that question, and then ultimately we'll move towards the emerging types, the pluriverse as he talks about. Yeah, Jahnavi, would you like to start on that?
Yeah, thanks, Raj. So what I meant by that is, and I said both the art world and the world of architecture. So this is not as I said, this is not a polemical claim. So it's not to say that architects can't or shouldn't use words. I mean, let's forget that bit, right? Like, or rather, let's bracket that. That's not the point. The point is that the expression of complexity, or the expression of what it is we're trying to do, often gets articulated in words, and in words. I wouldn't say words alone, but largely in words, right? One doesn't see that sort of that philosophy, that thinking, get enacted in the expression of space itself, or even art itself. So the statement for example, if you go to a Kochi Biennale, or Venice Biennale, or the Guangzhou Biennale, whatever it may be, the curatorial statement, the artistic statement, and similarly, in the Architecture Biennale in Venice as well, all various architects and their philosophies that I have sort of tried to familiarize myself with in the last 3.5 years, one finds that there is that the description, as you very rightly noted, is far more intricate than the expression of it in the building design itself. So the space itself communicates to me as a user, or as an occupier, or as a visitor, much less than the words themselves do, right? So the intent is stronger than the actual expression. And this is not a comment on any single architect, but this is a comment largely on my observation in the new projects that I see, whether in art or in architecture. The Biennale is the wrong place to be looking for realization for architecture, especially. For architecture, but for art it is, right? But for architecture, I am looking at newer projects, new buildings in the country, and to a lesser extent abroad, because the last 2 years I haven't been able to go. And before that, I wasn't as much obsessed with buildings as I am now. But I mean, and I'm happy to sort of, maybe later speak about buildings elsewhere, museums elsewhere, or, public spaces elsewhere. But I think right now I'm more focused on even not only public spaces, but even other kinds of spaces like educational institutions, libraries, etc. Is that the description is far more weighty, right? Like, so there's a massive distance. I mean, and I use the word massive very, very advisedly. Massive distance between expression and the actual, between description and the actual expression of it in shaping space, in structuring space, be it for public space, be it for urban design, be it for building, be it for a residential simple house, or complexes. It's word heavy. It's word heavy. We are talking too much. We are saying too much. We are writing too much. We are not. I think so what I mean is that words have become the preferred mode of expressing politics, activism, desire, intent. It's not it to a lesser extent, or it is how should I put it? That much intensity of intent of politics, of activism is not found in the built space itself, in the structure of the built space itself. That's my observation. That's where I'm coming from.
So was it really about there is you on one side who was sort of proposing the idea of the space, and I believe you were there right from probably a very, very initial stage of the project. Am I right?
Say that again. Sorry, I lost you for a few seconds.
As director of the place, you were involved with the design process from a very, very initial phase, I believe.
Pretty much so. I mean, yes, I did come in at a stage where there was some understanding, but yes, I've altered it sort of, altered, not
right
in its design since I came, and well before the construction began. Yes.
Right. No, so I'm really glad that you say this, because it seems to be a very, very true reflection of what we see around, and especially in the context of schools of architecture. One of the school of architecture which is hosting this, it's also a kind of a reflection of the reflection on the kind of visualization tools, the communication tools, the pedagogies that we build in our schools, probably, all of that, where it becomes kind of difficult for us to move or glide freely through boundaries that have been already established, which is actually very, very important. And I think that is probably a kind of a disillusionment that you found between what you wanted to do and what ultimately the visualization was bringing you with.
It's not just just as a caveat, it's not just my own space or the space I am trying to shape that I'm talking about, right? Because in order to understand what we were doing, I was also looking at other spaces around us, right? Like newer projects around us, educational institutions, museum-like spaces, libraries, public spaces of other kinds, urban sort of space design. So, pedestrian streets, for example, etc. So this is a more broader observation than just the project that I'm involved in. Yeah.
Sarosh, would you like to comment on that? Is that a problem that you've found? Is that a recent phenomenon, or is it that we've never really kind of found a method of moving outside of those jackets we've established for ourselves?
Yeah, I think it comes to the heart of a lot of things here. So I think that as architects, one of the things we are trained to do is to synthesize, because essentially we work across, the client, but we also work across many other entities, people who put buildings together, consultants, but also fabricators, and also people who write about buildings. And so I feel that the one thing that I value very much, one of the reasons why I wake up every day in the morning and brush my teeth, is that I love the idea that architecture is a synthetic profession. It is a place of synthesis. It is a place where different things come together. And I hope that we always keep that in mind, because we live in a world of increasing specialization and expertise. Everybody's an expert on something, and I insist that I'm not an expert on anything. And I appreciate that, because I think that we need a place where things can come together. And I think that the building has been for too long. One of the things, as a provocation here, I would say, is that the building has been for too long the site of synthesis, and maybe that is not necessary, right? Like the fact that the building is not alone should be much. It should be much more than that. It should be what I call a pluriverse, a world that should be a site of synthesis, because we've seen ecologically, from a climate standpoint, from a material standpoint, from a biodiversity standpoint, the problem of making the building the site of synthesis, right? So if the building is not the site of synthesis, and the world or the cosmological universe is the site of synthesis, then what do we get? And I think in terms of what Jahnavi is saying, the idea, somebody's mic is on and it's causing a lot of thank you, that's much better. So I think from what I learned from Jahnavi's presentation was she's also interested very much in a question of synthesis, because the science gallery is a place of synthesis. It is not a place of expertise alone, from what I understand. It is a place of communication. It is a place of collaboration. And it is also a remaking of public space. And what I love very much, Jahnavi, about the project is is what you said in the end, that we have always considered knowledge not to be a public good. And what happens if we make knowledge democratic, and what if knowledge is a public good? And I couldn't help but thinking, 3,000 years of Brahmanism have perpetuated an idea that knowledge is not a public good, right? And essentially, we have to create, again, an open-ended, plural system where multiple voices can thrive. It's not just that multiple voices can exist, but the idea of symbiosis is that they cannot exist without each other. They need each other to thrive. So I think that those thoughts are very related.
I think the distress created was from my mic. Apologies for that.
No problem.
The echo is back again?
No.
Okay. All right. So, okay. So continuing from that, I think, Sarosh, something that I really wanted to open this up to was about pedagogies. What kind of pedagogies are we developing in schools, and how really are we equipping ourselves? So, for instance, the kind of things that Jahnavi has gone through, she's read civics, and she's gone deeper into science, and ultimately, like you said, she's come back to realize that there's a very, very synthetic kind of a space that is the need of the hour. So, like she says, she wanted to really not showcase collaboration, but to actually demonstrate collaboration through the space that she was trying to set up at the Science Gallery. Yeah, I would really think that, especially in the context of a School of Architecture symposium that is happening now, and a lot of the tutors who are attending this and the students who are attending this, I think Jahnavi has already said something about how textual and how verbal we are when it comes to actually explaining the concerns, and not really visually being able to, or not really equipped enough to translate those into actualities. Yeah. So I think I would really ask this question to you as somebody who's been really involved with pedagogies at different places of different kinds, and now having gone through an extremely evolved kind of a state where we are looking at emergent types, we are looking at emergent worlds, we are looking at new vocabularies, we're looking at, just like you've gone back to the idea of the miniature, the flatness as opposed to the Euclidean, or the perspective, which is kind of always prioritized the individual over the rest of the things. Yeah. what are the kind of takeaways that we can have, or what are those things that we should look at as a school of architecture? Yeah.
Yeah, I find the provocation about visual thinking versus verbal thinking to be kind of a little ironical, because I feel like I have hugely been helped by both. So clearly my presentation today was very much about introducing other vocabulary, another kind of way of talking. So words sort of being very important in stitching that together. One of the things I want to be always mindful of is the kind of reduction of things to dualisms. So I am very wary of that. And I feel that in constructing a pluriverse, one has to sort of not create a world of dualisms. And so I do not see it necessarily as words versus pictures, because all of these things get kind of very much entwined into one another, right? One can look at a history of architecture that is purely through words or purely through visuals. But where I feel there are interesting kind of things emerging in terms of pedagogies, Raj, to come back to your question about that, is that the ideas of pedagogies themselves have been splintered so much. So while we have a world where we can talk, I'm talking to you in Kerala, and we're sitting for all places across the world. At the same time, there are local problems that are very pertinent, that have global implications. We understand them globally. We understand this is climate change, but they need to be solved locally, right? So there is the idea that the local has a certain valence, a certain value, which we can no longer ignore, and which we have to somehow acknowledge as a set of connected locals. And that is where this idea of cosmological localism or cosmolocalism is very important. So what if we talk to one another, but we didn't buy things from Amazon, but we rather sort of created a world where things are produced and consumed in close proximities to one another. And I think the idea of resilience, since resilience is an important part of this theme, is very much in the network. So what I was showing you about the kind of hog factories, right, in the US, where essentially there's a terrible kind of culling of pigs because people are not going to a factory, so millions of pigs have to be slaughtered. That would not happen if round the corner there were little pig pens. And so we created a world where we didn't have these vast agglomerations of wealth or even of matter, right? But things were much more dispersed, because in that case, if one farm didn't work, you could go to another farm, right? So the network somehow is much more resilient, and modernism has always privileged efficiencies that are built, that are highly efficient, but that are very linear. So if there's one little snap in the system, everything kind of breaks down. And I think that's also true of infrastructure, like, for example, electricity grids, right? So we've always privileged, or of dams, for example, I'll never forget this, that when I was in Ahmedabad, I think it was in the early years of the Narmada Bachao Andolan, when they were protesting against the construction of this massive dam. And, when I think it was even before Modi, it was during the time of Keshubhai Patel, and there was a massive drought in Saurashtra, and they couldn't keep up the dam building. They stopped it. Instead, they built 1,000 check dams across Saurashtra. And this idea that, they were very fast, they were not politically glamorous. It wasn't a one big thing. It was 1,000 small things. And so I think that this idea is very powerful in the way in which we create knowledge, and in the way in which we create a world.
Could I come in briefly, Raj?
Yes, please do.
So, I mean, Sarosh, I'm not suggesting a dualism. Yeah. Because the word, I mean, Joseph Beuys, who on one hand says everybody is an artist, also says the word is my starting point, right?
Right.
A word could be a starting point, an image could be a starting point. I mean, as an architect, an idea, a song, whatever could be a starting point, right? Like, so that is not under question at all. What I'm trying to say is that, I mean, what you gave right now, for example, was a discourse on global politics and how it, in a way, the way we have engineered a global political economy has an impact on how we lead our lives. What I'm trying to say is that what I am increasingly failing to see is how that manifests or is realized when I want to make the little space that I want to make, right? Be it my own apartment, be it my own house, be it a science gallery, or be it a library, or be it a public space, right? So that connect, I mean, again, you spoke about localism, for example. There isn't anything that is more actual than the local. I mean, the global manifests through networks, through, processes, through finance, through range of things. But you live on the ground. I mean, we have all sorts of complaints against linearity, and we've got philosophical expositions against linearity. Linearity is the only way in which we experience time, right? You're born, you live, you grow older every year. At some point, you die, right? So what does one do when your body experiences a certain thing? And in a way, your mind allows you to experience time less linearly, for example, right? Like, so I'm not even going to talk about quantum physics or anything of that kind. I'm just talking about there are many things one has to synthesize in order to ground an actuality, ground a reality. And so the expectation from the pedagogy of architecture would be one that created the tools for the realization of this discursive understanding of the world that needs to be altered. What you're calling for is a manifesto for change, is a political statement, is an activist statement. And I see that you're actually realizing it in your London project, right? But that, it has to find a realization. It has to find a manifestation, right? And I think that is where I find that many struggle. Right, and so I think that's the struggle I'm talking about. It's not a duality about
I understand what you're saying. Yes, yeah. I love your bringing Joseph Beuys into the conversation, because what I love about Beuys, I'll just say this since you brought up Beuys, is that he constructed a myth. And the myth was very important for him, right? And the myth was the fact that he was this kind of pilot who was shot down. I don't know if any of this is probably true. It's probably not true. But it was very important for him to live life. He couldn't live his life without making this myth that he was sort of covered in fat and felt after his air crashed. And at that point, when he was 20 years old, decided to become an artist. And so the idea of warmth and the idea of butter and fat and being covered in warmth remained with him and was part of everything he did in his life. And I think that myths are, again, something that the rational world has removed from our kind of conception. I think in India, we do a good job of somehow stitching that together. I think more than most places I have seen, that they are still part of our explanations of buildings. Doshi still talks about Krishna dancing wherever, and but most architects increasingly don't. And I think that myths are part of the pluriverse, and that they are very important in our construction of another world.
I would agree. I mean, I would agree because what holds things together in the end,
right?
What holds things together, and I think for each practitioner, it would be different sources, right? The sources of the self, as Charles Taylor calls them, right? Like those would be different, and therefore the expressions of them, in the case of architecture, or be it in the case of art, be it in the case of it, would be different, right? And that is where the joy would come from, right? Like, because then not every building you see looks like each other. Then that is when they will look different. That is when they will, sort of, yeah, and I don't see that. I don't see that. And that's the tragedy.
Right. So do we have questions coming in? You guys want to put some?
May I?
Yeah.
So it was interesting. We have been kind of following Sarosh's work for a while now, and today Jahnavi is kind of saying that words are not the primary tools of architects and filmmakers and artists and so on. And in this context, I would also kind of bring in something that Rahul Mehrotra had articulated, and again in a students forum recently, that there's a huge distance between an architect's sphere of intention and her sphere of influence, and that is what kind of leads to a lot of frustration. Okay, and I have heard Sarosh kind of refer to this no more schisms even earlier, where when I went and read that, so then again there was this articulation of that tectonics and activism are not separate.
Right.
And it can be through tectonics that you can practice activism, and that is what you're doing. And actually that is the position that that Jahnavi is also talking about. That it is not about words as primary tools. So your words can become supporting tools, but primarily speak through space and form. And do not be ashamed about it, And as schools of architecture, we ought to be talking about space and form in empowering manners.
Sure.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, Sarosh may have a lot to add to that, because
I see some interesting questions also in the chat. So whatever you want. But I agree with you, Kunjan. That's that I love that provocation. I mean, I again do not think that one has to choose between disciplinarity and everything else, right? Like I can make a wall section, and I can talk about world making through a wall section, and I think that is kind of that's my privilege. And an author will do it, a writer will do it in another way, and a painter will do it in a third way. And all of those are good.
Absolutely. Sumitra, you want to go, or there's a question from Aditya? Sebastian, what do you?
Yeah, perhaps after Aditya's question, because that's the order it came. I'm fine.
Okay, just hang on. So Aditya's question is to Sarosh. Even though synanthropic relation between humans and animals exists, we generally look at them as pests or intruders. So what do you think, where should this boundary be? How much can we have this cohabitation in an urban context?
I get that a lot. I get a lot of but I cannot live with this spider in my house. Are you kidding me? And nobody's asking you to do that. Certainly not. But there was an interesting study done not so long back that said that there is more biodiversity in New York City. There are more species living in New York City than in the entire state of, pick a square state like Kansas, where they have a monocrop. So they have only corn or only soy. And because of that, there is no biodiversity left because of big agriculture, because of the ways in which we've created, monoplantations, all of those things. The thing that I will say is that we need a revolution in the way in which we think about building envelopes. And there's a lot of interesting work there, because we do not account for, so there's a lot of, Raj, I think your mic is up again. I'm sorry to do this, but so if you think about the building envelope, there's a lot of engineering over the last 30, 40 years that have gone into extremely high-tech envelopes. We get facade consultants these days who come in with, there are so many envelopes, so many layers of the facade, right? And you think of something like the insulated glass panel, very, very common. Recently, there was a building here in Pittsburgh where 40,000 insulated glass panels have to be thrown away. How do we reuse them? And essentially what has happened is that in the desire for extreme operative efficiencies, we have not thought about embodied energy, and we've not thought about where is all this material coming from, all the mining that happens. And how does this relate to synanthropism? Because if you imagine a biological paradigm, right? So if you imagine a brick that because it has mycelium on it, it is half alive and half dead. These kinds of studies do happen, right? So if the biological world actually manages humidity, manages air pressures, perhaps better. That is one research that we really need to do. So it may not be at a level where you sort of see the spider running around, but it could be that your facades are covered with a kind of intelligent moss that will regulate humidity, instead of having an extractive system where you mine something from the Congo, it goes to China. In China, it gets processed, then it comes to the US, then it gets stuck somewhere, then it goes into a landfill again. The moss will not do any of those things, right? So the idea is that would be synanthropic. That would be sort of, or more than synanthropic, it would essentially be a biological paradigm. And I think across the sciences, we are seeing more of this biological paradigm permeate into many disciplines.
Sumitra? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for both the talks. Dr. Phalkey, this is for you. First of all, great to see another STS person. We are about 100 in India, so it's nice when one runs into another STSer. That's the first thing. The second thing, I was thinking about the online exhibitions that you ran during the pandemic time, right? So there was Phytopia and Contagion. I did not see Phytopia. I saw Contagion. My question to you is, based on that experience of running two exhibitions entirely online, has that changed any aspects of your ideas with respect to your wish list that you would like to give to your architect? I'm sure you already had this conversation. Would you like to share? So what of that online, which is like completely disembodied? It's a different kind of space, a different kind of spatial understanding. So yeah.
Thank you, Sumitra. Thank you for your kind words. So, moving completely online, I mean, I don't think I completely articulated for you what that transformation has been, right? Because there has been a change, but I don't know that I am myself fully aware. And so in a way, I was almost wanting to be challenged, right? It's like looking for a fight. I want to be asked this question. So thank you for asking it. So it's not fully clear in my head, but let me give you a few sort of things to hold on to, which I am holding on to. The first thing is that the first decision that I took was that we will not try to replicate in the digital exhibitions whatever it was that we wanted to do in the physical exhibitions. That would not be the way to approach it. What is the fidelity of the medium? What can the digital offer? And let's sort of, in a way, mobilize it for what it can do rather than expect it to do something else, right? So that was the starting point. So Phytopia was an experiment. We did it over 10 days just to see, what kind of skills we required, what kind of resources we required. So the obvious outcomes of it were we reached audiences we had not reached before. We reached places we hadn't reached before. So from being a Bangalore institution, we kind of expanded, right? Like, so 79% of our audience was outside of Bangalore. Not necessarily all of it outside India. I think 5% of it was outside of India, but 79% of our audience then came from outside of Bangalore. And that was a surprise to us. But the other part of the surprise was that, so we offer mediated sessions, right? Online walkthroughs. 73% of our mediated sessions were in Indian languages. And that was actually something we hadn't anticipated. And, in hindsight, of course, you can say, what the hell, why didn't you anticipate that? But we didn't, And this was primarily drawing on the fact that our mediators, had different mother tongues, ranging from the 4 southern Indian languages to Hindi, Marathi, Gujarati also. And so we offered these sessions based on, we said to our mediators, whatever language the audience in a way wants, and if you're comfortable doing it, do that. And then we found out that the majority wanted that. So that was a learning. I'm not entirely sure how we are going to mobilize that and what that means for us going forward. The one decision again we have taken is that we will continue with this element even after we go fully physical, because of the work it does. And what does it do? The digitally native young have found ways to hook into our exhibitions much more than before. So if you look at the proportion of our visitors when we did the, again, we are very young, 2 physical, 2 digital exhibition, right? Like, so, it can't be like I can't make a massive, statement about it. But from drawing on this limited experience, what I can say is our visitors to our exhibition were not to the same extent as young as the visitors were to our digital exhibitions. So up to 50% of our visitors were between the ages of 15 and 28, 15 and 30 online. That wasn't the case in our physical exhibitions, right? Like that was more mixed. It was sort of nearly equal. We had little ones also, and, sort of much older, even people in the 80s who came. So that's one thing. So that's something it tells us. That's something it tells us in terms of the kind of audience that we can reach, or, that is looking, but it also tells you what the young are in a way engaged with. It also allows us to reach those, members of our audiences who are introverts, who probably would not want to come and walk through an exhibition, but are much more comfortable putting on headphones and playing a game and walking through the exhibition, right? Like we also have games in the exhibition. So much so for, very dispersed, descriptive observations of what we have learned through that. Now, coming to your very pertinent question about, how do we understand the relationship between our virtual space and our real space, so to speak, right? And that is where, in fact, I would love to hear more from Sarosh, but also all of you, right? Like how does one make sense of, because it's your profession that's at the heart of this in many ways, right? The shape and form versus virtual space and form, right? How, it's a very difficult thing to grasp, also because we are living through it. And I'm of a generation that came to the internet world in my early 20s, right? Like, I first used a computer when, when I was in my early 20s. I hadn't seen a computer before that. It's for my younger team members who are in their 20s, they connected into it immediately, right? Like they knew the platforms. It's like, okay, this can be done on Discord, this can be done here, that can be done there. So they understand the contours of this virtual space far better than I do. I'm beginning to walk alongside them. I'm still slightly behind, but I'm beginning to, get a grasp on what it is that's happening. I think the key question though is the one that you are asking, which is how does this alter our expectations of the physical space, right? And I think I do not like botanical metaphors and analogies. I won't call it things like hybrid. I think the physical space in many ways will have to integrate with the digital work we are doing, right? So how do you bring the virtual world? So in a sense, I'm actually, in fact, doing the same mistake, which I said we didn't want to do at the start. But I don't know if it's a mistake, of the fidelity of the virtual medium and the fidelity of the physical space. Now I'm going to make that mistake and say, how do I integrate the digital into our physical space, right? The most obvious answers are very simple. Screens, touch, nothing rocket sciencey about it. But this has to be something bigger than that. So I'll give you the problem that I set out for our architects. It's not resolved at all. At the start of our project, right? And I put it not only to architects, I also put it to our architects not our architects, architects of the Science Gallery in Melbourne. And I also presented it to several of my friends. So now those of us in India have some of us have gone to the Gol Gumbaj, right? where you light a matchstick in one corner, you hear a whisper in another, right? What is it doing? The space is mobilizing a particular quality of sound, right? So it has integrated into itself a quality that is inherent to sound. I mean, spatial acoustics and whatnot, I mean, that those are disciplines that as architects you will be aware of. But when I see it from the outside, it's sound, it's the quality of sound that is being mobilized, right? The acoustical qualities or the acoustic quality of the architecture or the built space is abstracted. You don't see it. What you see is sound. Now the problem I presented was, is there something we can do for data, right? Or the digital, right? Like not data per se, but like the digital in built space that does this work, right? Where that quality in the architecture is abstracted, but what you experience is that thing, right? I don't know the answer to this because I have not, I mean, and my lame and cheap excuse is because I've not studied architecture, but I don't have the imagination to do it. I don't think spatially, right? I think words. I mean, that's all I'm able to do. So I don't know. But if any of you can solve this problem for me, I'm willing to, do something in the building that'll yeah. So it's a question that I have. What an answer.
Thank you.
That's a wonderful question and an answer. It's just that, I feel sorry that it came towards the fag end of the discussion. I've been told strictly that I need to wind up by 6:15. So we have hardly a few moments left. And Sarosh, would you want to add something to that? Because it's a very, very pertinent point.
It's a very old problem, right? About integrating those two words. And I think that there are many things here. I mean, a lot of those in your question, you already answered, Jahnavi, but I like very much the idea that there are the capacities to also have, you said you don't like the word hybrid, but essentially a way in which these two things can combine. Maybe there are certain events that happen, concurrently. I mean, it does problematize the question of time very much. I think this is going to be very important moving forward because we're very soon going to find Zoom and Google Meet to be very insufficient. We're going to want more. And, I have no idea what that's going to be, but I can imagine everything from holograms to, and to also, digital. What we're also going to see is the opposite. I also think we're going to see people taking digital. I see sometimes my friends saying I'm on a digital sabbatical. So they're just working and you'll get one email from them in the day. That's still somehow a digital sabbatical. But this idea also of the opposite is going to become more present in our lives. But it's one of the conundrums of our civilization. Where are we going to take this? But I think that this also is where the local becomes very interesting because it is no longer the local of, I don't know, E.F. Schumacher, small is beautiful. It is no longer the local of even people like Gandhi, whom I love, respect, and admire immensely. But it is a different kind of local, right? It is a local where there are many locals. I mean, arguably right now, we are a local, although we are all sitting in different places. Right, we create a kind of local ecology with the 51 or 50, 60 speakers here. So the idea of local is also something that will transcend and change and create new forms as we create new locals. But thank you again, everyone. This was really wonderful, and I'm very thankful for the invitation. And thank you, Jahnavi, for the incredible provocations.
No, thank you all. I mean, I'm just thinking ABBA is going to have a concert next year, and it's going to be that hologram spoke about. ephemeral, right? So whereas the Golgomba stays, right? Like, so my thing is this the quality, right? Is the ephemerality the quality, or is there something else that stays, right? Like, I mean, it's going to be fun. It's going to be fun to find out. And, you know, it's, as you very rightly said, so it's things, you know, we'll have to do it together, all of us. So thank you again for the kind invitation. This was good fun. This was lots of good fun.
Thank you so much, Jahnavi and Sarosh. Happy that both of you could be here, and for the wonderful presentations as well. Thank you, Avani, once again. Saumini, some final words from you?
Yeah, thank you so much, Raj. This is a very, very interesting conversation. I think it's the beginning of a conversation and not quite the end of a conversation. Because I'm sure the students, and I'm glad that Aditya asked this question, because Aditya is also doing some research as part of his bachelor's thesis. So I think this is very provocative, and this conversation, we are going to take it forward as part of our studio, which is being led by Adra, Mithun, and Benny for sure. So I really look forward to having you all back in Avani for another round of conversation on this. So thank you so much, Raj, for the wonderful job that you've done. Thank you all.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you.
See you all very soon. Physical, non-physical, digital. Let's meet. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Thanks, Sarosh. Thanks, Jahnavi.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.